Screams and sirens echo through Dublin's city centre. Flames roar into the night sky as a city bus and a police car burn. Masked rioters hurl debris. Shop windows shatter amid the chaos. Riot police in visors and shields form a line, their silhouettes stark against an inferno of fire. Just hours earlier, this street was filled with commuters and schoolchildren. Now it's a battleground. How did it come to this? Ireland, long celebrated as the land of 100,000 welcomes, is now gripped by a new slogan. Ireland is full. In the past year, communities across Ireland have been convulsed by fiery protests, violent clashes, and raw emotions over immigration. A series of flashpoints, from a knife attack on schoolchildren to the torching of refugee camps, have exposed a stark divide. Neighbours have faced neighbours in the streets, united only in their fear or fury. Migrants seeking safety have instead found themselves at the centre of rage. Ireland is a country shaped by migration. For generations, Irish people emigrated around the world, and the nation has prided itself on greeting newcomers with Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes. But in the 2020s, that self-image has been challenged. A rapid influx of refugees and asylum seekers, combined with a severe housing crisis, has upended the narrative. The result is a collision of compassion and concern, hospitality and hostility. By the end of 2022, Ireland was grappling with an unprecedented surge in arrivals. The war in Ukraine sent over 58,000 Ukrainian refugees to Ireland by mid-November 2022. At the same time, the number of asylum seekers from other countries hit record levels. 13,651 people sought international protection in 2022, a 415% increase from the previous year, the highest ever recorded. The state suddenly found itself providing housing for around 73,000 migrants by early 2023, including over 54,000 Ukrainians and about 19,000 asylum seekers, up from just 7,500 a year earlier. This influx, in a country of about 5 million, strained an accommodation system already near collapse. Authorities scrambled to shelter everyone. Hotels, B&Bs, sports halls, former office blocks, and tent camps were repurposed as emergency housing virtually overnight. The International Protection Accommodation Service, the government body tasked with housing asylum seekers, had to open makeshift centres in every corner of Ireland. More than 64,000 people needed shelter in 2022 alone, forcing the use of unconventional sites like disused warehouses and office buildings. A government spokesperson admitted these solutions were less than ideal, but the sheer scale of the crisis left no alternative. At the same time, Ireland was experiencing one of Europe's worst housing crises. A massive shortage of homes, an estimated deficit of 250,000 units, had already driven rents to record highs and left many Irish families struggling. Homelessness climbed to unprecedented levels. Countless people, even those with jobs, could not find affordable housing. Now, the arrival of refugees and asylum seekers was perceived by some as competition for scarce resources. The stage was set for tension. Ireland's tradition of welcome was about to collide with the reality of a nation under strain. In early 2022, as Ukrainian families fleeing war arrived, communities opened their arms. Local halls hosted clothing drives. Host families took in strangers. Irish people have shown remarkable solidarity and welcome, the Taoiseach, Prime Minister, declared in late 2022. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Non-Ukrainian asylum seekers, often single men from Africa, the Middle East and beyond, were arriving in greater numbers than ever. And unlike the mostly women and children Ukrainian refugees, these newcomers received a chillier reception in some quarters. By autumn 2022, signs of backlash began to emerge. Concern turned to anger in certain communities selected as sites for emergency refugee accommodation. Lack of consultation was a major grievance. In many cases, residents would wake up to find buses arriving with dozens of migrants, without any advance notice from authorities. The government, citing urgency, often bypassed the usual community discussions. This sparked feelings of disrespect and disenfranchisement among locals. As one East Wall resident put it, "All we saw were videos of men being bussed into the area. You can't bang up to 380 people into a community and expect there not to be any adversity. Frustration mounted over issues of capacity and fairness. Locals pointed at Ireland's thousands of homeless citizens and asked why disused buildings were being turned into refugee shelters overnight when Irish families remained without homes. Our own Irish people haven't got a place to go, whereas they can turn this ESB building into accommodation overnight, complained East Wall resident Emma Douglas, insisting it has nothing to do with racism, but rather the unfairness of it. Her neighbours nodded in agreement. In their eyes, the state seemed to find instant solutions for refugees that it never found for local housing needs. By late 2022, a narrative of Ireland is full was taking hold. On social media and at demonstrations, new slogans gained popularity. Ireland is full, Ireland for the Irish, Irish lives matter. These phrases, echoing populist sentiments abroad, tapped into both genuine anxieties and xenophobic undertones. At first, many Irish leaders and citizens were shocked. This was the land of welcomes, not slogans lifted from far-right playbooks. Yet, as the numbers arriving kept growing, the slogans spread. Even some who rejected hate began to wonder if Ireland's capacity had limits. International agitators fanned the flames. British commentator Nigel Farage applauded the Irish protests, tweeting that unlike the English, the Irish are speaking out about the huge number of young male asylum seekers. His words were gleefully shared by anti-immigrant activists, emboldening them. It was an unsettling development. Ireland's internal debate was being cheered on by far-right figures abroad. East Wall, Dublin, November 2022. In this tight-knit working-class community near the city's docks, the fuse was lit. Without warning, an empty office building owned by the ESB, Electricity Supply Board, was hastily converted into an emergency shelter for asylum seekers. In mid-November, about 80 migrants, all single men at first, were moved in as the first occupants. The plan was to scale up to 380 people, including families, across 5 floors of dormitories and rooms. But the locals of East Wall had not been consulted, and many were furious at being bypassed. On November 19, 2022, hundreds of East Wall residents took to the streets in protest. They gathered outside the former office block on East Wall Road, holding signs and shouting slogans. The protest was loud but initially peaceful, an outlet for a community's sense of betrayal and fear. Residents like 26-year-old Emma Douglas voiced sympathy for refugees in general, yet decried the sudden influx without notice. "We agree with having refugees," she said, "but you can't just drop 380 people on a community. Of course there's going to be adversity." Others pointed out that local schools, clinics and housing were already overstretched and worried about the impact of so many newcomers. While many East Wall residents stressed, it's not about racism, some specific concerns revealed a deeper unease. When you have so many young men coming into the area, no one knows who they are or where they're from. "Of course we have concerns," said one local man at the protest. A mother of 5 told reporters her daughters were afraid to go out at night, with so many unfamiliar men nearby. These comments reflected a fear of the unknown, amplified by rumors that some asylum seekers might pose a danger. It must be noted that police found no increase in crime linked to asylum seekers, and officials emphasized that most refugees are law-abiding. Still, fear often outpaces facts. The lack of women and children in the initial group of arrivals also fueled local suspicions. In East Wall and elsewhere, people asked why many centres were filled with unvetted single males. To some, it just didn't look good, feeding a false narrative that these weren't real refugees, since genuine refugees are often imagined as mothers and kids. The government explained that single men were simply the first moved from overcrowded reception hubs, and that families would follow. But by the time that message came, mistrust had set in. At subsequent East Wall protests, the mood hardened. Night after night, crowds gathered, even blocking a nearby tunnel road at one point. Local community leaders took the microphone to insist they weren't racist, only neglected by authorities. East Wall is a multicultural neighborhood, and we want to keep it like that, resident spokesman Nigel Murphy declared, but they put 150 men in this building without any consultation, snuck them in the middle of the night. The crowd roared in approval. Murphy tried to direct blame upward. Our anger must be directed towards Integration Minister Roderick O'Gorman. That's where the anger is. He urged people not to scapegoat the asylum seekers themselves, calling them pawns in a game. But not everyone listened. As Murphy spoke, shouts from the crowd betrayed an uglier sentiment. Some yelled "plantation," invoking a charged historical term for colonization. Others shouted, "This is our country," and demanded the refugees be removed. When Murphy suggested the migrants are not the enemy, a voice shot back, "They are the enemy." Chants of "Get them out" rippled through the assembly. These moments, captured on video, sent a chill through observers. It was becoming clear that far-right agitators had mingled with local protesters, stoking the flames of xenophobia. Indeed, extremist groups actively seized on East Wall's unrest. The small Irish Freedom Party, known for anti-immigrant, anti-EU views, circulated leaflets and social media posts calling the refugee arrivals a new plantation of Ireland orchestrated by the government. They urged people nationwide to support the East Wall protests. Conspiracy theories abounded online, claims of a secret plot to replace the Irish population with foreigners. At one East Wall gathering, a man openly ranted about a plan to replace the Irish, reflecting the Great Replacement theory imported from far-right movements abroad. Such ideas, once fringe, were now being aired on Dublin streets. The East Wall protests ignited a chain reaction, seeing one community successfully force the government's attention and temporarily pause new arrivals to that centre. Other towns and neighbourhoods began organising. Within weeks, similar protests erupted in Ballymun, Drimnagh and Finglas, working-class Dublin districts with new refugee accommodations. The contagion spread beyond the capital. Mullingar in Westmeath, Fermoy in Cork, Lismore in Waterford, Kill in Kildare and more all saw locals rally against nearby migrant centres. By the end of 2022, Gardaí police logged 307 anti-immigration protests across the country. The movement that started in East Wall had gone national. Irish leaders grappled with how to respond. The Taoiseach at the time, Michael Martin, acknowledged that there should be consultation with locals and appealed for continued warm welcomes for refugees. But many felt that promise came too late. His successor, Leo Varadkar, bluntly stated that it would not be right for locals to have a veto on the kind of people who get to live in their area. Yet Varadkar also admitted the government needed to improve communication and transparency to avoid blindsiding communities. Plans were announced to consult local representatives and provide information before opening new sites. Whether that happened consistently is debatable. What is clear is that East Wall marked a turning point. It legitimated for some open resistance to refugee resettlement. As one protest organizer boasted, "We have shattered the taboo. We moved the political ground. This was the great unspoken." For better or worse, a door had been opened. And once open, it would prove difficult to close. Early 2023. Through the winter and spring, anti-immigration protests continued to flare up across Ireland, like sparks catching in dry tinder. Almost every week brought news of another demonstration outside a hotel or former school earmarked for refugees. By March 2023, police noted that the frequency of protests peaked, with multiple events per week before settling into a persistent rhythm. The Gardaí reported at least 169 additional protest incidents in the first 8 months of 2023. While most protests were peaceful, a darker undercurrent of threats and violence accompanied many of them. In Mullingar in February 2023, about 300 people gathered to oppose housing asylum seekers in an old army barracks, chanting that their town had done enough. In Kilcummy in Kildare, locals demonstrated outside an equestrian centre slated for Ukrainian refugees. That very building was mysteriously set alight the same day after the crowd dispersed. In working-class Ballymun, Dublin, nightly protests outside a refugee hotel featured placards like "Ballymun says no" and drew far-right activists from outside the area. Fermoy and Mallow in County Cork saw dueling rallies. Some residents protested new refugee facilities, while others organised rally against racism events to show support for migrants. This reflected a split in Irish public sentiment. Many communities were indeed welcoming, even holding pro-refugee counter-protests, but the angry voices often grabbed more headlines. The Irish government struggled to accommodate everyone in need. By January 2023, Integration Minister Roderick O'Gorman shockingly announced there was no more room in the system. With all reception centres and hotels full, some newly arrived asylum seekers were left sleeping on the streets of Dublin, an unprecedented scenario in Ireland. A makeshift tent camp sprang up on Mount Street in central Dublin, steps from the International Protection Office where asylum applications are processed. Within weeks, about 60 tents lined the sidewalk and a nearby alley, forming a visible symbol of the state's overwhelmed capacity. For the men living there, from countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, it was a grim refuge. They clustered together for safety, aware that not everyone in the city welcomed their presence. Anti-immigration agitators latched onto the image of tents in the capital as evidence of government failure and as an opportunity. In January 2023, a particularly disturbing incident occurred in Ashtown, North Dublin. There, a small group of homeless migrants had been living in tents in a wooded area since the summer. After videos of their camp spread on Facebook with menacing comments, "Bottle of petrol and that's it," vigilantes decided to take action. 4 men with dogs and a baseball bat invaded the Ashtown camp on a Saturday afternoon, shouting, "Get out now!" and attacking the migrants' tents. A young Croatian man was beaten with the bat. He suffered bruises, but fortunately not broken bones. Terrified, the migrants fled, abandoning the camp for good. "They mean business. It's going to get worse if we stay," one shaken resident from Portugal said as he packed his few belongings and left for the city centre with no plan. The attackers later claimed, without evidence, that someone in the camp had committed a local assault, a rumour police could not substantiate. In reality, it appeared to be a premeditated, hate-driven assault, egged on by toxic online rhetoric. The Ashtown attack sent shockwaves through Ireland. Here were vigilantes explicitly targeting migrants, emboldened by social media misinformation. Gardaí confirmed they were investigating it as a possible hate crime. In response, local activists organised an anti-racism rally in the area, determined to show that this thuggery did not represent the majority. But for migrants sleeping in tents around Dublin, the message was clear. They were not safe. "It wasn't like I expected a mansion, but I wasn't expecting this. As long as it's safe," a 30-year-old Zimbabwean man in the Mount Street camp said stoically. Days after Ashtown, his emphasis on safe was telling. Tensions continued to escalate. Rumours and false accusations against asylum seekers proliferated, often spread by far-right activists to whip up fear. In one case, an Afghan refugee in Limerick was falsely accused online of approaching children. A far-right group confronted and filmed him, posted his image with lies, and the very next day the man was beaten up by someone who recognized him from that video. He was innocent, a victim of dangerous defamation that nearly cost him his life. Garda Commissioner Drew Harris warned that communities were being misled. Most rumors of migrants committing crimes were baseless, and there had been no spike in crime due to asylum seekers. But on the ground, fear and anger often outpaced truth. Each new incident became a rallying cry for protest groups. By the spring of 2023, Ireland's dual crises, housing and migration, had fully intertwined. Protesters regularly accused the government of neglecting its own people in favour of outsiders. "I've a housing crisis, 6 of us in a 2-room flat," one Dublin mother vented at a rally. "Shame on the government. Look after your own first." Such sentiments resonated widely. A poll in mid-2023 found that 56% of Irish people felt Ireland had taken in too many refugees in the past year. The nation was starkly divided. While nearly half believed local protesters were just concerned neighbours, roughly the same proportion saw far-right agitators as the primary instigators of these protests. Both were true to some extent. Legitimate local concerns were real, but extremists were indeed exploiting them. As one counter-protest organizer put it, far-right activists are harnessing legitimate grievances for xenophobia. It's not a solution to turn on refugees. Alongside the protests, a wave of violence against migrant accommodations swept the country. literal fires igniting the figurative fire of tensions. Arson and vandalism became troublingly frequent. Some incidents seemed clearly driven by anti-immigrant motives. Others occurred amid swirling rumors and could not be definitively linked, but the pattern was hard to ignore. This pattern wasn't entirely new. There had been isolated attacks on proposed refugee centers in the late 2010s. In fact, the first major arson attack had occurred back in November 2018, when a hotel in Moville, Donegal, set to house 100 asylum seekers, was firebombed just a week before opening. A few months later, in January 2019, another future centre, the Shannon Key West Hotel on the Leitrim-Roscommon border, was burned down after anti-migrant surveillance. It was hit again by a second fire in February 2019. That same year in Leitrim, a protest leader, Sinn Féin TD Martin Kenny, who spoke in support of refugees, had his car torched outside his home. These early incidents were warnings of things to come. They largely faded during the COVID pandemic, but starting in late 2022, they resurged with a vengeance. In November 2022, on the very day locals protested, the Kill Equestrian Centre in Kildare, earmarked for Ukrainian refugees, was set alight in a suspected arson. This was the same month the East Wall unrest began, a sign that some protests were already tipping into criminal acts. Then, in January 2023, a fire gutted Rulton House, a derelict building in Dublin that online conspiracy theories had wrongly claimed would become a direct provision centre. Gardaí investigated links to misinformation spread on social media. It appeared that false posts about hundreds of migrants coming may have directly inspired someone to strike a match. The violence only escalated as 2023 went on. The most shocking incident came in May 2023 in central Dublin. On May 12th, after a small anti-immigration protest, a group of hooded men descended on the makeshift tent camp on Sandwith Street, where dozens of homeless asylum seekers had been sheltering. In a chilling attack caught on video, they set the tents on fire, shouting, "Take it all down, make it unlivable," as flames engulfed the only shelter these refugees had. Fortunately, the tents were unoccupied at that moment and nobody was physically hurt. But the camp was destroyed, charred sleeping bags and debris strewn in the smoke. 5 men were arrested in connection with the incident. Prime Minister Leo Varadkar condemned it as malign opportunism by a tiny minority, determined to make capital out of a difficult situation. Yet for the refugees now left shivering on Dublin's streets, the attack was terrifying. One resident of the camp, a Ukrainian man named Volodymyr, tried to find a silver lining. "It made us famous. The Taoiseach even became aware of our situation," he said, noting that only after the fire did the government redouble efforts to get them into proper accommodation. Still, he admitted they spent their days wandering the city, looking for a socket to charge your phone, trying to preserve dignity and safety in a country that suddenly felt far less welcoming. Also in May 2023, in County Donegal, there were 2 brazen attacks in 1 week. A firework was launched at a direct provision centre housing 50 asylum seekers in Buncrana. Thankfully, it missed the window and exploded on the roof. And in nearby Ludden, a building that a businessman had offered for Ukrainian refugees was burned down before it could open. In Cork, a disused school in Ballincollig, slated for refugee accommodation, was set ablaze in July 2023. Locals there were dismayed. A councillor called it an attack on us all, an attack on the community. In South Dublin, an empty building in Ballybrack, rumoured wrongly to be for asylum seekers, was firebombed in August, after its windows had been smashed during an anti-immigrant protest a month before. The pattern was clear. Whether a site actually housed refugees or merely was speculated to, it could become a target. Then came November 2023, when the powder keg truly exploded, as we glimpsed in the opening. On November 23rd, a horrific incident occurred outside a school on Parnell Square East in Dublin. A man in his 50s stabbed several young children and a woman in broad daylight. Heroic bystanders intervened and subdued the attacker, and emergency services rushed the victims to the hospital. Among them was a 5-year-old girl in critical condition. Dublin was in shock. Within hours, however, shock gave way to violence of a different sort. Unverified rumors spread like wildfire online that the perpetrator was an immigrant. Some posts even named a foreign-born suspect. Though police had not confirmed any details, far-right groups seized the moment. They called followers to rally in the city centre that evening, ostensibly for the kids. But their intent was revenge and chaos. What unfolded that night was one of the worst riots in modern Irish history. A mob, estimated around a few hundred, rampaged through Dublin's main thoroughfares: O'Connell Street, Westmoreland Street, the areas around Parnell Square. They hurled paving stones, fireworks, and bottles at Gardaí. They overturned and torched vehicles, including 2 police cars and a double-decker Dublin bus, right in the heart of the city. Shoppers and tourists ran for cover as looters smashed into stores. A sports shoe shop was ransacked, its goods strewn on the sidewalk. By night's end, at least 34 people were arrested for riot, arson, theft, and assaults. Over 400 Garda officers had been deployed, including riot squads and mounted police, to eventually quell the disorder. Miraculously, no deaths occurred during the riot, but many were injured and the city was left traumatized. The riot had explicitly anti-immigrant undertones. Rioters were heard chanting xenophobic slogans and Irish nationalist chants. One focal point of their fury was a Holiday Inn Express hotel on Cathal Brugha Street, known to house many refugee families. Rioters set it on fire, apparently believing immigrants were inside. Firefighters saved the building before flames spread beyond an entrance. In Finglas, a suburb, opportunists took the moment to petrol bomb a building earmarked for refugees that same night. The message from the mob was clear. This was vengeance, not just against the individual stabber, but against Ireland's migrant population at large. This conflation, blaming all immigrants for one man's crime, was precisely what authorities had feared and warned against as misinformation swirled. In truth, the attacker in the Parnell Square stabbings was an immigrant, reportedly a long-time Algerian resident of Ireland, but he had no known political or religious motive, and mental health issues were suspected. The police repeatedly stressed it appeared to be an isolated act by a lone individual, not linked to broader immigration issues. That didn't matter to the rioters. As Justice Minister Helen McEntee put it, a thuggish and manipulative element had cynically used an appalling tragedy to wreak havoc. Garda Commissioner Drew Harris was even more blunt. A complete lunatic faction, driven by far-right ideology, was behind the mayhem. In the aftermath, Ireland collectively recoiled at the scenes that had played out on live television. The riot was a wake-up call. President Michael D. Higgins captured the nation's mood by condemning those sowing hate and building fear around refugees as unforgivable. He noted that the agitators whipping up violence never cared about housing or women's rights before, they're just exploiting the situation. And he urged Ireland to stand firm against this hate. Taoiseach Varadkar declared the rioters not protesters but criminals, and vowed to bring them to justice. Over subsequent weeks, dozens of individuals were identified via CCTV and arrested for the riot. The government also fast-tracked efforts to tighten hate speech and incitement laws, aiming to impose harsher penalties on those who foment racist violence. Yet, the November 2023 riot also laid bare the depth of division. A poll soon after showed the public split on what the protests, and by extension the riots, represented, whether it was mostly genuine local concern or far-right agitation. And significantly, it showed a majority believed Ireland had taken in too many refugees in the past year. In other words, while almost everyone condemned the violence, many sympathised with the notion that Ireland was full and needed a pause. The challenge for Ireland's leaders became how to address people's concerns without validating the hateful narrative underneath. Through all these turbulent events, it is easy to lose sight of the human stories at their centre. On one side, Irish communities struggling under economic and social pressures. On the other, migrants who fled danger only to encounter new dangers in Ireland. Their experiences form the emotional core of this divide. Take Lisa O'Neill, a Dublin mother of 7 in her 40s. She lives with her partner and kids in an overcrowded 2-bedroom flat, a housing situation that's unfortunately common. Lisa joined the big Dublin protest march in January 2023, carrying a tricolour flag. "I have a housing crisis, 6 of us in a 2-room maisonette," she told a reporter, anger flashing in her eyes. "Shame on the government. Look after your own first." Her words struck a chord. She wasn't directing hatred at refugees, she said, but rather venting frustration that her family's plight seemed invisible while resources were found for newcomers. For Lisa, the system felt profoundly unfair, and protesting was her way to demand attention. But standing just across the street from her that day was another Irish woman, Fiona Smith, holding a sign that read, "Diversity, not division." Fiona looked at the anti-immigrant crowd and felt dismay. "It's shocking. It's full of hate. Complete ignorance," she lamented. Fiona works with Syrian refugees and worried that the backlash would deepen their trauma. Two Irish women, two very different perspectives, each shaped by personal experiences and values. And what about the migrants themselves? Most have kept a low profile, wary of attracting hostility, but some voices have emerged. Omar, an engineer from Somalia, arrived in Ireland seeking asylum and was placed in a remote rural town. He recounted how, at first, locals were friendly enough, a smile here, a nod there. But when a protest against his hostel broke out, people he'd seen on the streets started glaring at him with suspicion. "It changed overnight," he says. "I stopped going for evening walks because I didn't feel safe." Omar's case is not unique. After the tent burning in May 2023, an African asylum seeker told The Guardian he and his friends stick close to the central camp now because you don't want to be out camping on your own. Safety in numbers, even if numbers means a sidewalk full of tents. One young refugee, Andil from Zimbabwe, spoke to a journalist while living in the Mount Street tent camp. Bundled in donated clothes against the Irish damp, he tried to remain upbeat. "You make do with what you have, as long as it's safe." The word safe hung in the air, a reminder that for him, sleeping in a tent in Dublin was still preferable to the danger he fled. But he admitted nights were cold and uncertain. Another camp resident, a 46-year-old man from Ukraine named Volodymyr, described how the attack on their camp at least had one effect. "It made us famous. The Tawiseach even became aware of the situation," he said wryly. Yet fame was little comfort while he spent days wandering the city with nothing to do, trying to charge his phone at public outlets and maintain dignity as a displaced person. From the perspective of the Gardaí police, these protests and attacks have been a major strain. Assistant Commissioner Angela Willis noted that the surge of demonstrations reached a peak in March 2023, meaning resources were stretched to monitor frequent pop-up protests. Every evening spent guarding an improvised refugee shelter was an evening not spent on regular community policing. When the November riot happened, over 400 officers had to be mobilized, a stark illustration of how quickly public order can deteriorate. Gardaí have also faced criticism. Some community members felt the police didn't do enough to prevent intimidation of migrants, while protesters at times accused Gardaí of heavy-handedness or ignoring their concerns. It's a difficult balance. After the riot, Commissioner Harris was clearly angry. Not at peaceful protesters, he emphasized, but at the lunatic faction that attacked his officers and wrecked the city. "We need to take our streets back from these people," he effectively said, framing them as a threat to Ireland's democracy. Politically, the divide has also tested Ireland's parties. The opposition Sinn Féin, typically champions of the working class, found itself in a tricky spot. Its leader, Mary Lou MacDonald, was denounced as a traitor on a protester's placard for supporting refugee rights. Some Sinn Féin local reps quietly sympathized with protesters in their constituencies, even as the party leadership maintained a pro-refugee stance. Meanwhile, smaller far-right groups like the Irish Freedom Party and National Party, normally on the fringe, tried to ride the wave of discontent to gain mainstream traction. Thus far, they remain marginal, garnering tiny percentages in polls, but their visibility has increased. A Sunday Independent poll in mid-2025 found that about 44% of people believed far-right agitators were exploiting the protests, even as 48% felt protesters were mainly ordinary concerned residents. The truth encompasses both. Real community issues inflamed by malign actors. Amid this, community leaders and NGOs have tried to soothe tensions. The Irish Refugee Council urged better dialogue, warning that Ireland was drifting into very dangerous territory by stigmatizing all single male refugees as potential threats. "Some of the most vulnerable people I've worked with have been single men," said IRC Chief Nick Henderson, noting that demonizing them is unjust and can be a thin veil for racism. Local volunteer groups have sprung up to welcome refugees. For example, in January 2023, residents of a small village in Clare organized a Kaid Meal Falka party for new Ukrainian neighbors, even as, elsewhere, roads were being blocked. These quieter acts of kindness often go unreported, but they persist. They remind us that Ireland's divide is not absolute. Many communities are working hard to integrate newcomers despite the challenges. One illustrative confrontation happened in a rural corner of Western Ireland, showing how tensions played out outside the cities. Inch, County Clare, a tiny village of a few hundred people, suddenly found itself host to 34 asylum-seeking men in May 2023. They were being housed in a former hotel called Magona House, tucked away down a country lane. When locals learned of it, they reacted with outrage at the lack of consultation. Fears abounded. Could this small place handle dozens of foreign single men? Why weren't women and children among them? Was the remote site suitable, or were these men being effectively dumped in isolation? Within days, locals organized a blockade. In a dramatic standoff, farmers used tractors to block the narrow road to the accommodation center. Vehicles were parked across the entrance, and protesters maintained a presence 24/7, refusing to let any additional asylum seekers in, or initially even supply trucks through. Tensions ran so high that at one point a few locals boarded a bus carrying some of the asylum seekers to count and film them, trying to verify who was inside, an act widely condemned as harassment. This surreal siege lasted for over a week. The men inside Magona House were essentially trapped. They later described feeling scared and unwanted, hearing the angry chants outside. The government dispatched officials to negotiate. Under pressure, Integration Minister O'Gorman agreed to a compromise. No further arrivals would be sent to Inch for at least 4 weeks, and a forum would be established for locals to air concerns. Only then did the residents lift the full blockade, though protests continued daily at the site. The Inch saga garnered national attention. Some hailed the locals for standing up to a dictatorial decision by Dublin bureaucrats. Others excoriated them for essentially imprisoning vulnerable people and succumbing to fear-mongering. After all, these 34 men had done nothing wrong. They were simply seeking refuge and had the misfortune of being sent to a community not prepared to accept them. Inch demonstrated a recurring rural dynamic, small communities feeling overwhelmed by sudden migrant arrivals and questioning why larger towns or cities, with more services, weren't hosting them instead. The government's answer was that every county had to share the burden and that many cities were hosting thousands. Dublin, for example, accommodated over 20,000 Ukrainians and international protection applicants by 2023. But that logic offered little comfort to a village of a few hundred asked to absorb 30 out of 50 strangers overnight. Transparency and early engagement might have mitigated these flare-ups. Yet officials often skipped that step, fearing that advance notice would allow protests to mobilize before migrants even arrived. It became a vicious circle. No consultation led to outrage, which led to protests and blockades, which then made the state even warier of announcing plans in advance elsewhere. As of mid-2025, Ireland continues to wrestle with these issues. The intensity of protests has ebbed somewhat from the fever pitch of early 2023, but tensions remain high. The government's latest figures show around 74,000 people are still in state-funded accommodation, including roughly 49,000 Ukrainian refugees and 25,000 asylum seekers. Those numbers, while slightly down from the 2023 peak, are still enormous for Ireland's size. Housing construction has increased, but not nearly enough to erase the housing deficit. Homelessness among Irish citizens remains a political crisis. In short, the underlying pressures fueling the divide have not vanished. However, there are glimmers of hope. The violent Dublin riot of November 2023 served as a shock that galvanized the silent majority. In its wake, spontaneous rallies against racism and division were held. Just days later, hundreds of Dubliners gathered on O'Connell Street, scene of the riot, not to protest migrants, but to reject hate. They chanted, "No to racism, no to fascism," and held banners reading, "Refugees welcome," despite the previous chaos. Community groups, trade unions, and ordinary families came together to say the rioters did not represent Ireland. L'Échelle, Ireland for All, a coalition of civil society groups, organized large peaceful demonstrations in early 2024, emphasizing solidarity and urging calm dialogue instead of street confrontation. These events didn't get the same sensational coverage as violence, but they mattered. They reminded everyone that Ireland's famed hospitality was wounded, not dead. The Irish government has taken some concrete steps too. Funds have been allocated to accelerate renovations of vacant buildings into housing, tackling two problems at once. There are over 100,000 empty homes in Ireland. Even repurposing a fraction could alleviate pressure. Officials have also started local liaison committees in areas getting refugee centres, bringing together residents, migrants, and officials to address issues proactively. This was a key demand from community leaders who said their voices were ignored at the start. And importantly, security around refugee accommodations has been bolstered. After the tent burning, Garda patrols were increased at known protest flashpoints to deter copycat attacks. Many Irish people, even some who protested initially, were appalled by the vigilante violence and agreed that no matter what, nobody should be attacking vulnerable people or burning buildings. Public opinion remains split, but not immovable. According to a major poll in 2025, about 44% blame far-right elements for stirring trouble, while 48% believe protesters have legitimate local concerns. And while 56% feel Ireland took in too many refugees too quickly, a substantial minority disagrees or is unsure. These numbers suggest many Irish are in the middle, sympathetic to refugees and worried about capacity, rejecting hate but demanding fairness. It's a nuanced position that unfortunately gets lost in the din of slogans. Perhaps the most heartening development has been the resilience of the migrants themselves and the communities that embraced them. In cities and towns across Ireland, integration is quietly happening every day. English classes at community centres, GAA sports clubs inviting refugee kids to play, parish halls where Syrian and Ukrainian families cook meals to share with locals. These grassroots interactions don't make headlines, but they build the social fabric. Over time, as new arrivals become neighbours and co-workers, fear of the unknown can give way to familiarity. Ireland has seen this before. In the 2000s, during the Celtic Tiger economic boom, immigration surged and there were teething problems. But today, Poles, Nigerians and Romanians who arrived back then are part of the Irish mosaic. The current wave is larger and more sudden, yes, but integration is not impossible. The Irish state will need to address the legitimate grievances that fueled the divide. That means accelerating housing construction so that refugees are not perceived as displacing Irish families, a point President Higgins himself made, urging the country be filled with services to support both communities and newcomers. It also means cracking down on disinformation and hate speech that have poisoned discourse, through education, community dialogue, and yes, law enforcement where necessary. Ireland has proposed new hate crime legislation and policing resources to combat racist intimidation. These tools must be used judiciously to target the small hardcore of extremists without demonizing concerned citizens. As of mid-2025, Ireland continues to wrestle with these issues. The intensity of protests has ebbed somewhat from the fever pitch of early 2023, but tensions remain high. The government's latest figures show around 74,000 people are still in state-funded accommodation, including roughly 49,000 Ukrainian refugees and 25,000 asylum seekers. Those numbers, while slightly down from the 2023 peak, are still enormous for Ireland's size. Housing construction has increased, but not nearly enough to erase the housing deficit. Homelessness among Irish citizens remains a political crisis. In short, the underlying pressures fueling the divide have not vanished. However, there are glimmers of hope. The violent Dublin riot of November 2023 served as a shock that galvanized the silent majority. In its wake, spontaneous rallies against racism and division were held. Just days later, hundreds of Dubliners gathered on O'Connell Street, scene of the riot, not to protest migrants, but to reject hate. They chanted, "No to racism, no to fascism," and held banners reading, "Refugees welcome," despite the previous chaos. Community groups, trade unions, and ordinary families came together to say the rioters did not represent Ireland. Lachéile, Ireland for All, a coalition of civil society groups, organized large peaceful demonstrations in early 2024, emphasizing solidarity and urging calm dialogue instead of street confrontation. These events didn't get the same sensational coverage as violence, but they mattered. They reminded everyone that Ireland's famed hospitality was wounded, not dead. The Irish government has taken some concrete steps too. Funds have been allocated to accelerate renovations of vacant buildings into housing, tackling two problems at once. There are over 100,000 empty homes in Ireland. Even repurposing a fraction could alleviate pressure. Officials have also started local liaison committees in areas getting refugee centres, bringing together residents, migrants, and officials to address issues proactively. This was a key demand from community leaders who said their voices were ignored at the start. And importantly, security around refugee accommodations has been bolstered. After the tent burning, Garda patrols were increased at known protest flashpoints to deter copycat attacks. Many Irish people, even some who protested initially, were appalled by the vigilante violence and agreed that no matter what, nobody should be attacking vulnerable people or burning buildings. Public opinion remains split but not immovable. According to a major poll in 2025, about 44% blame far-right elements for stirring trouble, while 48% believe protesters have legitimate local concerns, and while 56% feel Ireland took in too many refugees too quickly, a substantial minority disagrees or is unsure. These numbers suggest many Irish are in the middle, sympathetic to refugees and worried about capacity, rejecting hate but demanding fairness. It's a nuanced position that unfortunately gets lost in the din of slogans. Perhaps the most heartening development has been the resilience of the migrants themselves and the communities that embrace them. In cities and towns across Ireland, integration is quietly happening every day. English classes at community centres, GAA sports clubs inviting refugee kids to play, parish halls where Syrian and Ukrainian families cook meals to share with locals. These grassroots interactions don't make headlines, but they build the social fabric. Over time, as new arrivals become neighbours and co-workers, fear of the unknown can give way to familiarity. Ireland has seen this before. In the 2000s, during the Celtic Tiger economic boom, immigration surged and there were teething problems. But today, Poles, Nigerians and Romanians who arrived back then are part of the Irish mosaic. The current wave is larger and more sudden, yes, but integration is not impossible. The Irish state will need to address the legitimate grievances that fueled the divide. That means accelerating housing construction so that refugees are not perceived as displacing Irish families, a point President Higgins himself made, urging the country be filled with services to support both communities and newcomers. It also means cracking down on disinformation and hate speech that have poisoned discourse through education, community dialogue, and yes, law enforcement where necessary. Ireland has proposed new hate crime legislation and policing resources to combat racist intimidation. These tools must be used judiciously to target the small hardcore of extremists without demonizing concerned citizens. In the tiny village of Knockanore, County Waterford, community volunteer Jane German finishes a charity table quiz when her phone buzzes. An urgent request has come in. A young Pakistani mother, just 10 days after a difficult C-section birth, is stranded at Cork University Hospital with her newborn, unable to get home to Lismore. Jane doesn't hesitate. She and a friend drive an hour through the darkness to the hospital, then another hour back, bringing the mother and baby safely to the Lismore House Hotel, the only home the woman knows in Ireland. She had very little English and had never met us before, Jane recalls. She was exhausted. In the middle of the night, we just couldn't leave her there. This is Lismore for All, a volunteer group born in spring 2023 after initial local unease about asylum seekers turned into a determination to help. Since that night, Jane and her neighbors have undertaken over 100 such rescues, drives to hospital appointments, late-night pickups, mostly for pregnant women and new mothers who have no car and no other way to travel. They've organized English conversation classes and even a little career clinic for job-seeking asylum seekers. They invite newcomers to join the local tidy towns cleanup, making sure everyone feels part of the community. These everyday acts of welcome are quietly knitting migrants and locals together. In Jane's words, you can't do 3 bus connections when you're pregnant, so we've got a rota now, ensuring no expectant mother ever faces a journey alone. Lismore is not alone. Scores of volunteer groups have sprung up across Ireland in the past 2 years, a grassroots counterpoint to fear and division. In North Cork, when an international protection accommodation centre opened in Fermoy in late 2023, locals initially protested, some fearful, some supportive. But out of that divide grew a new alliance of neighbours determined to befriend the asylum seekers. Activist Chris O'Connell remembers how it started. We saw abuse being hurled as buses arrived with women and children. We couldn't just go home after that. So they stayed, helping register children for school, finding family doctors to take new patients, collecting toys and clothes. It was all basic stuff, O'Connell says, but sometimes you feel you're doing the work of the state. Thanks to their efforts, when a second group of asylum seekers arrived months later, government officials, perhaps having learned from community feedback, moved faster to arrange school places and paperwork. Still, Chris notes, there's one thing officials can't easily do: befriend people or show them how the local soccer club works. That, she insists, takes genuine local goodwill, something her group has in abundance despite the lingering distrust they work to dissolve. We struggle to help local people understand we have nothing to fear. What we really need is positive messaging from the government that these people are not to be feared, she adds pointedly. The government is shying away from doing that properly. In Dublin's inner city, volunteer networks have also rallied under pressure. The group Phibsborough for All began simply, hosting tea and chat evenings and football matches to welcome refugees. But by summer 2023, their mission transformed dramatically. A group of homeless asylum seekers, all single men with nowhere to go, had set up a makeshift camp by the Royal Canal. Phibsborough locals responded with an outpouring of humanity, delivering hot food, water, blankets, even opening their own bathrooms and showers to the men who had none. Some neighbours took the most vulnerable individuals into their spare bedrooms rather than see them sleep in a tent another night. When a mob of hooded men barged into the canal camp one night, shouting racist slurs and threatening to attack, the volunteers did something extraordinary. They formed an overnight watch patrol, taking shifts to guard the campsite until morning. We had people in their 70s offering to cover the 2 a.m. slot. One volunteer marveled. The power of that intergenerational support was remarkable. For safety, many of these do-gooders remain anonymous in public. It's not safe to be named in the media as helping refugees, one tells us warily, yet they persevere. They've seen firsthand that someone must care for these men when official systems fall short. It's very basic. We just want them to feel someone cares about them, says a volunteer in another Dublin support team, summing up why they keep showing up, rain or shine. Across Dublin's neighbourhoods, East Wall, Ballymun, Inchicore, for all groups have emerged as beacons of compassion. In East Wall, where the arrival of asylum seekers in late 2022 initially sparked angry street protests, a coalition of residents formed East Wall for All to offer a different response. They organised community events with the new residents and provided practical support, but also found themselves buying toothpaste, soap, even hot water bottles out of their own pockets for the asylum seekers in the repurposed office building shelter. Volunteers shouldn't be the ones buying basic necessities for residents, one East Wall for All member says with frustration. Some of us feel we're putting in hours of work that people should be paid for. It's like the government is happy to wash its hands of it. This sentiment echoes nationwide. While proud of what they've accomplished, many community leaders worry that an over-reliance on volunteer goodwill isn't sustainable. They call for more resources and a true partnership with the state to support integration. Community leaders should be funded to work with officials on integration plans, the East Wall volunteer argues, because integration is a two-way street, and right now there's no guidance on what it actually means in practice. Despite these challenges, the spirit of volunteerism has unquestionably softened the landing for thousands of newcomers. The Irish government has started to acknowledge this, at least in words. In late 2023, Minister of State for Integration, Joe O'Brien, launched public consultations for a new national migrant integration strategy, explicitly thanking community groups for filling gaps and promising to involve them in policy. The Department of Integration expanded its community engagement team in 2024 and began posting weekly factual updates online to counter the swirling rumors that often spark fear. It's also reviewing how integration funds are distributed, after criticism that funding had been ad hoc and chaotic, with no one person looking at where integration money is being awarded. Volunteer networks welcome these steps, but caution that action must follow the words. They know that lasting integration is not built in a day or by goodwill alone. It requires investment, coordination, and addressing local concerns alongside migrant needs. For now, the heart of integration in Ireland beats strongly at the community level. Every English lesson over a cup of tea, every shared football game or sanctuary runners' jogging session, where Irish residents and asylum seekers run side by side in solidarity, helps transform strangers into neighbours. These small moments, repeated in towns and cities across the island, push back against a narrative of division. Lost in these debates on immigration is the value of inclusion, says Social Democrats leader Holly Cairns. The work of countless organisations, groups and individuals across Ireland shows the value that immigrants and asylum seekers bring. They are our friends, family and loved ones, our teachers, nurses, builders and hospitality workers. In community halls and GAA clubs, in libraries and kitchens, that vision of an inclusive Ireland is being built from the ground up. It's a vision in stark contrast to the scenes of conflict that have grabbed headlines. To understand those, we must widen our lens beyond these grassroots stories and see how Ireland's struggles fit into a broader European picture. Ireland's debate over immigration is unfolding alongside similar tensions across Europe. Many of the threads we see in Ireland, community solidarity on one hand and fear-driven backlash on the other, are playing out from Paris to Berlin, from Stockholm to Rome. To truly grasp Ireland's situation, we journey briefly to 5 European countries where immigration has sparked unrest, shaped politics, or both. Let's start in France, a nation long proud of its ideals of liberty and equality, yet now wrestling with its own immigration divide. In late 2023, the French government introduced a new immigration bill promising tougher rules. The proposal proved deeply contentious. In cities across France, tens of thousands of protesters marched to voice their opposition, about 16,000 in Paris and some 75,000 nationwide, fearing the law would scapegoat migrants and undermine French values. No to the immigration law, they chanted in the streets, joined by human rights groups and left-wing parties, insisting that security crackdowns won't fix integration challenges. Even as civil society pushed back, France's far-right narrative gained traction. Politicians like Marine Le Pen have for years linked immigration to crime and social unrest. In the summer of 2023, that subtext burst into the open when France was rocked by days of riots after a police officer fatally shot a 17-year-old French youth of North African descent during a traffic stop. The unrest, cars torched, stores looted, was not an anti-immigration protest per se, but it exposed the raw wound of marginalization in communities of immigrant origin. It jolted the nation into asking why integration has faltered for many French-born children of immigrants. President Emmanuel Macron's government, caught between addressing these grievances and appeasing anti-immigration sentiment, hardened its tone. Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin pushed for expedited deportations of undocumented migrants involved in crime. And Macron's party, traditionally centrist, even flirted with right-wing positions to undercut Le Pen's national rally. By late 2024, internal divisions over how far to go led to political turmoil within Macron's camp. France's dilemma is clear. With a presidential election on the horizon in 2027, immigration has become a fulcrum on which the country's political future may pivot. The streets of Paris have echoed with both anti-immigrant rallies and anti-fascist counter-rallies. a sign of a society profoundly split, much like Ireland, but on a larger scale. Across the Irish Sea in the United Kingdom, immigration has been a flashpoint for years, especially since Brexit. In early 2023, tension erupted into violence on the streets of an English town. On a cold February night in Knowsley, near Liverpool, a crowd of several hundred protesters, whipped up by rumours on social media, descended on a hotel housing asylum seekers. What began as an angry demonstration turned into a riot. Far-right agitators threw projectiles and set a police van on fire as officers in riot gear struggled to contain the chaos. The mob, some armed with makeshift weapons, tried to storm the hotel. Panicked asylum seekers huddled inside. One charity worker recalled, "I don't know if the asylum seekers will be safe. I am deeply shocked and shaken by what I have witnessed tonight." Police eventually arrested several rioters for violent disorder. The local MP implored residents not to believe wild rumours, stressing that stories about refugees being feather-bedded were untrue, and emphasising that those attacking refugees do not represent this community. The vast majority in Knowsley, he insisted, are welcoming to people escaping the most dangerous places in the world. We are not like that. Even as Britons recoiled at the violence, the issue of asylum seekers arriving on small boats across the English Channel was fueling a political firestorm. The Conservative government in London adopted the slogan, "Stop the boats." In 2023, it passed the Illegal Migration Act, effectively banning anyone who arrives irregularly, for example, in a dinghy across the Channel, from ever claiming asylum in Britain. The law mandates rapid detention and deportation of such migrants, potentially to third countries. A much-publicised plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing, despite legal challenges, became a symbol of the hard line, though the UK Supreme Court later ruled the Rwanda plan unsafe, stalling its implementation. Home Secretary Suella Braverman's rhetoric grew stark. She described an invasion of migrants on the south coast, language that critics said emboldened far-right groups. Sure enough, far-right organisations like Patriotic Alternative piggybacked on that wording, chanting "End the invasion," as they staged more protests outside hotels housing refugees. Throughout 2023 and 2024, scenes of unrest popped up around the UK. In coastal towns like Skegness and Newquay, demonstrators marched against asylum seekers staying in B&Bs, only to be met by counter-protesters chanting anti-racist slogans. In some cases, violence flared. Outside a hotel in Dover and elsewhere, police had to separate crowds. An undercurrent of fear ran through Britain's asylum hotels. One Iranian refugee said after Knowsley, "Some locals threatened to kill us. We hardly sleep at night now." A coalition of human rights groups warned that asylum seekers in hotels needed urgent protection from harassment and attack. Even police noted a spike in hate incidents around these sites. The mental health of many asylum seekers deteriorated as they felt unwelcome and unsafe. The UK government, meanwhile, doubled down. It deployed military barracks and even a barge, the Bibi Stockholm, as accommodations to deter crossings, though not without controversy and health scares. By mid-2025, with a general election looming, both major British parties were vying to appear tough yet fair on immigration. Britain's saga illustrates a cautionary tale: how easily toxic narratives can translate into real-world suffering. As one activist put it, our politicians' rhetoric of hate and division is destroying our society and our values. It's a sentiment many in Ireland would recognise, and one authorities in Dublin are determined to heed, lest the worst of Britain's experiences be repeated on Irish soil. Travelling east to Germany, we find another country at a crossroads. Germany took in more than 1 million refugees in 2015 under Angela Merkel's famous "Wir schaffen das," "we can manage it" ethos. But a decade on, immigration is again a flashpoint, and Germany's far-right party, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, is experiencing an alarming surge. By mid-2023, the AfD was polling around 17 to 19% nationally, an all-time high for this once fringe party, putting it neck and neck with mainstream parties for second place in some surveys. The AfD's platform pulls no punches, stop immigration, slash support for asylum seekers, and even oppose climate policies they deride as costly green agendas. This rise has shocked Germany's establishment. Mindful of the country's Nazi past, all other parties have cordoned off the AfD from governing coalitions. Yet as the AfD gains voter support, especially in economically struggling eastern states, its xenophobic rhetoric has started to seep into mainstream discourse. Even some center-right politicians now call for stricter limits on refugees, declaring the numbers too big and urging cuts to benefits for asylum seekers. With heated talk has come heated streets. Germany has seen a spike in anti-immigrant incidents. In early 2024, a wave of arson attacks on refugee shelters spread fear. In February of that year, a suspected far-right fire in Leixlip, Ireland, coincidentally underscored a similar trend. German authorities logged 218 politically motivated attacks on refugee accommodations across the country in 2024, up from 167 the previous year. The capital, Berlin, reported a marked increase in assaults on refugees, 77 physical attacks in 2024, more than double the prior year, plus several instances of mobs vandalizing housing facilities. At least 34 refugees were injured badly enough to need hospital treatment in Berlin alone. This is an alarm bell, warned a Berlin lawmaker as he released the data, calling for greater police protection at migrant homes and a crackdown on right-wing agitators. Refugee centers in places like the former Tegel airport hangar in Berlin are overcrowded and on edge. Staff now station security guards 24/7 for fear of intruders or hate-fueled violence. Yet amid these dark developments, German civil society is pushing back. In February 2024, in an extraordinary display of pro-democracy sentiment, hundreds of thousands of Germans took to the streets in cities across the country to protest against far-right extremism. Under banners reading "Solidarity instead of hate," people of all ages and backgrounds marched to say "Nein" to racism. These rallies, from Berlin's Brandenburg Gate to small village squares, signaled that a large swath of Germans refused to let the AfD's message go unchallenged. Germany's president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, urged citizens to stand up against hate and division, invoking the memory of the 1930s as a warning. Interior Minister Nancy Faeser pointed out that far-right propaganda was fueling a rise in attacks on refugees and vowed to intensify monitoring of extremist networks. The fight for Germany's soul, like Ireland's, is playing out not just in Parliament, but in neighborhoods and online forums. The stakes are high, with multiple regional elections in 2024 and a federal election due in 2025. How Germany handles immigration and rebuffs extremist forces will echo far beyond its borders. In Sweden, the narrative of immigration has undergone a dramatic shift. Once known for its generous refugee policies, Sweden in recent years has tightened the tap, a change driven largely by the rise of the Sweden Democrats, SD, a right-wing populist party. Since 2022, the SD hasn't officially been in government, but it wields kingmaker power by supporting a minority coalition of mainstream right parties. In exchange, the SD's hardline stance on migration has heavily influenced policy. The result? An all-out tightening of Sweden's migration rules. The government slashed the annual refugee resettlement quota to just 900 people, down from 5,000 in previous years. It imposed stricter requirements for immigrants to gain permanent residency or citizenship, including tougher language tests and longer waiting periods. Aid to asylum seekers has been cut, and proposals have been floated to require asylum applicants to stay in isolated state-run centers, preventing them from moving freely or integrating while their cases are processed. The Swedish government unabashedly calls this a paradigm shift. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, reliant on SD's votes, has said Sweden needs a pause on asylum to fix integration issues like gang crime. Indeed, a troubling backdrop to Sweden's debate has been a surge in deadly gang violence, often linked to marginalized immigrant-heavy neighborhoods, which anti-immigration politicians exploit as evidence of failed multiculturalism. The Sweden Democrats themselves have a controversial history, rooted in neo-Nazi origins decades ago, and they still argue that Sweden's national identity is under threat from high immigration. Now they are effectively setting the tone of national policy. Not everyone is on board. Opposition parties and activists warn that Sweden's reputation as a humanitarian haven is being shredded. Even some right-leaning Swedes are uncomfortable with, for example, stripping citizenship from some migrant Swedish-born children, an idea mooted by SD members. But for the moment, the hardliners have the upper hand. What's striking is how swiftly political winds can change. In 2015, Sweden welcomed Syrian war refugees with open arms. By 2023, it was raising the drawbridge, if not literally, then certainly rhetorically. This about-face offers Ireland a glimpse of how political dynamics, a frightened public, anti-immigrant parties on the rise, can translate into swift policy reversals. If Ireland's own relatively liberal stance on refugee reception waivers, Sweden's experience may be instructive. Still, Swedish society remains divided. Large portions of the public oppose xenophobia and continue grassroots integration efforts, even as the government pursues a strategy of deterrence. In short, the Nordic model of integration that Ireland once looked up to is now being rewritten under populist pressure. Finally, we turn to Italy, a frontline state for Europe's migration flows, now led by one of Europe's most avowedly anti-immigrant politicians, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Meloni rose to power in October 2022 on fiery promises to stop the invasion of migrants. But governing has tested those promises against hard reality. In 2023, Italy experienced a sharp surge in boat arrivals across the Mediterranean. By mid-September 2023, more than 126,000 people had arrived in Italy by sea that year, nearly double the 66,000 in all of 2022. It was the highest level of arrivals Italy had seen in years, reminiscent of the peak migration crisis of 2015-2017. Nowhere was the influx felt more acutely than on the tiny island of Lampedusa, a rocky speck of land that is Italy's southernmost point. In one chaotic 48-hour period in September, over 7,000 migrants landed on Lampedusa, an island of only about 7,000 residents itself. The island's sole reception center, built to house a few hundred people, was swamped with thousands of desperate arrivals. Videos from Lampedusa showed heartbreaking scenes. Exhausted migrants crammed into an open-air enclosure, aid workers scrambling to distribute food and water, and a 5-month-old baby tragically drowning when a flimsy boat capsized just offshore. The local mayor declared a state of emergency and blasted both Meloni's government and EU leaders for failing to help. "We're overwhelmed," he warned, calling the situation one of the most chaotic in many years. Italian police, overwhelmed and on edge, at times resorted to forceful measures to control the surging crowds. For Meloni, who had campaigned as the champion of Italy's hard-right nationalists and vowed to block migrant boats, this was a political crisis. "It's a huge embarrassment for her," noted one political analyst, as even her supporters began to ask why the boats hadn't stopped. Her government's approach, striking deals with North African countries like Tunisia to prevent departures, has yielded only partial results. Critics call the strategy inhumane and ineffective, arguing that it outsources Europe's moral responsibility and often leaves migrants in distressing conditions abroad. Meanwhile, tragedies have continued. In February 2023, a wooden boat crammed with migrants broke apart in rough seas off Calabria in southern Italy, drowning at least 94 men, women, and children. Italians were horrified. Some blamed the government for discouraging rescue efforts by NGO ships. Meloni expressed sadness but defended her policies, insisting the only solution was to stop migrants from departing in the first place. Domestically, Italy has seen flashes of anti-immigrant protest and violence over the years, from riots in Rome in 2014 to far-right marches in 2023. However, many Italian communities have also shown generosity. For instance, residents of Riots and other towns famously revitalized their villages by welcoming refugees. Under Meloni's tenure, though, the official tone has been combative. The government has pushed through stricter asylum rules and made it harder for new arrivals to get humanitarian protection. It even threatened fines and impoundment for humanitarian rescue ships that save migrants at sea without authorization. Europe has tried to help Italy under a new burden-sharing pact, but that too has caused friction. Some countries, like Germany in 2023, temporarily halted taking relocated asylum seekers from Italy, accusing Rome of not honoring agreements. Italy's saga underscores a broader point: tough rhetoric versus complex reality. Even a staunchly anti-immigrant government has struggled to manage the forces pushing people to Europe's shores. The Mediterranean Sea, much like Ireland's own experience with unexpected refugee inflows, is a reminder that human desperation doesn't heed political slogans. As Italy navigates between compassion and crackdowns, it offers lessons to Ireland. Integration and border management are multifaceted, requiring both humane responses and international cooperation. Having surveyed Europe, we return now to Ireland, better informed about the context and ready to examine how Irish politics is grappling with immigration. If Europe's story is any guide, political leadership and rhetoric can powerfully shape the public mood. So what are Ireland's leaders saying and doing? In Ireland, immigration has swiftly moved from a peripheral topic to centre stage. As protests flared and asylum accommodation ran scarce in 2023, politicians across the spectrum were forced to articulate where they stand. Let's walk through the major parties and their positions on immigration, asylum policy and integration, from those in government to the opposition and the newer right-wing voices. Sinn Féin, Ireland's largest opposition party, and as of late 2024, poised to lead the next government if election trends hold, has carefully refined its message on immigration. In July 2024, Sinn Féin launched a new international protection policy, outlining how they would handle the asylum system. Party leader Mary Lou MacDonald, speaking in Dublin's city centre, emphasised a word that keeps coming up: community. At the heart of our policy is community, the need for engagement and dialogue, MacDonald said, contrasting her approach with what she called the government's ad hoc strategy. Sinn Féin's plan proposes audits of local services before opening any new asylum accommodation in an area to ensure the locality has the GP capacity, school places, transport links, and other supports needed. The idea is to avoid overburdening disadvantaged areas, a response to criticisms that the state was citing large numbers of asylum seekers in communities already struggling with housing or crime. MacDonald argued it's a fairer ask to locate asylum centres in places better off in terms of services and infrastructure, rather than concentrating them in poorer districts. In essence, she sent a message: better off suburbs and towns need to do their share in hosting refugees, not just working-class areas. This stance is politically shrewd. Sinn Féin draws much support from working-class Dublin and rural towns, communities that in some cases led protests and felt ignored by elites. By acknowledging those grievances, without endorsing the ugly aspects, Sinn Féin is positioning itself as a mediator, willing to welcome refugees but insisting on planning and common-sense fairness in distribution. The party's immigration spokesman made headlines by stressing that enforcement is part of the plan too. He noted that currently, people whose asylum claims are rejected often remain in limbo, and that enforcement of deportation orders is not working at the moment. A Sinn Féin-led government, he said, would increase resources to process asylum cases faster, tripling the staff of the International Protection Office from 400 to 1,200 to clear backlogs, and would cooperate with the UK to return individuals who first claimed asylum in Britain. This references the principle that asylum seekers should be returned to the first safe country they entered, a tricky prospect post-Brexit, but Sinn Féin indicated it would seek a bilateral deal with a likely Labour-led UK government in 2025. MacDonald was quick to clarify that their approach is very different to that of the government, aiming to end what she called the policy of private profiteering, a jab at private operators of direct provision centres, and replace it with non-profit, state-led accommodation. Sinn Féin has also had to confront the far-right narrative head-on. After the November 2023 Dublin riot, Mary Lou MacDonald herself was accosted by anti-immigrant hecklers in her constituency. A small, aggressive crowd outside an East Wall community centre shouted "traitor" and demanded she answer about illegal aliens as she tried to get to her car. MacDonald did not engage with the insults. Later, a Sinn Féin spokesperson firmly said those thugs in no way represent the people of East Wall. It's a great community. Privately and publicly, Sinn Féin leaders acknowledged that legitimate community concerns about resources, consultation, etc., are being exploited by a tiny extremist element. MacDonald has walked a fine line, unequivocally condemning racist violence. There is no excuse for attacks on innocent people, she said, but also arguing that the government's failure to plan and communicate created a vacuum for fears to fester. In a radio interview, she noted the state's huge mistake in how it communicated with the public, saying communities shouldn't be labeled racist for asking questions, but that answers must come with facts and reassurance. This calibrated approach perhaps explains why Sinn Féin, despite the fraught atmosphere, has largely maintained its broad popularity. The party promises a new immigration management agency to coordinate all aspects of the system, essentially a pledge to bring order, humanity, and community voice into Ireland's approach. As the 2025 elections approach, many will be watching to see if Sinn Féin can truly deliver on these promises, or if they too will be tested by the hard realities of governing. The centre-right Fine Gael and the centrist Fianna Fáil have led Ireland together in a coalition with the Greens through this tumultuous period. Together, they've tried to strike a balance, condemning hatred and defending Ireland's tradition of openness, while also acknowledging capacity strains and implementing tighter controls. Taoiseach Saoirse, Prime Minister Leo Varadkar of Fine Gael, perhaps epitomised this balance, or tightrope walk, in his response to the November 2023 riot. Standing amid the damage in Dublin city centre, Varadkar delivered a fiery rebuke to the rioters. These criminals did not do what they did because they love Ireland or wanted to protect Irish people, he declared the next morning. They did so because they're filled with hate. They love violence, they love chaos, and they love causing pain to others. He praised the heroes who tackled the knife-wielding attacker that day, and in the same breath, castigated the mob that wreaked havoc afterward as a lunatic hooligan faction driven by far-right ideology, bent not on patriotism, but on wanton destruction. Varadkar's unequivocal stand, essentially telling the rioters Ireland is not theirs to burn, drew wide support. He also assured immigrant communities of the government's protection. In the Dáil, Parliament, his ministers spoke of defending our multicultural society, and they fast-tracked funding to help businesses rebuild after the riot. Yet Varadkar has also voiced the concerns of many Irish people about the sheer numbers arriving. In mid-2023, as asylum applications hit a two-decade high, he remarked that Ireland's capacity is finite, a notable statement in a country that had prided itself on not setting an upper limit on refugee admissions. "There's a limit to our hospitality," one Fine Gael TD echoed, citing pressures on housing and public services. The government quietly implemented some stricter measures. For instance, in early 2023, they paused accepting new asylum seekers who arrived without families, leaving some single men sleeping on the streets due to lack of accommodation, a highly controversial move later reversed as emergency shelters were sourced. In September 2023, after the gallows incident outside Leinster House, Justice Minister Helen McEntee, a Fine Gael minister, condemned the intimidation, but also stressed that the state would deport individuals involved in serious criminality or those clearly not refugees. Indeed, government data showed deportation orders were up, even if carrying out those deportations lagged, and asylum approval rates tightened in 2023, with a majority of initial decisions resulting in refusals. Fianna Fáil, the traditional Republican Party partnering with Fine Gael, broadly mirrored this stance. Tánaiste Deputy PM Michel Martin repeatedly called out sinister forces behind some anti-immigrant protests, suggesting that an organized campaign of arson and intimidation was at play in certain incidents. After a spate of fires at proposed asylum sites, Martin said it beggared belief that so many random accidents were occurring, asserting that there is clearly an organized campaign trying to terrorize communities and refugees alike. Fianna Fáil ministers have stood firmly by the EU's approach to sharing responsibility. Ireland opted into new EU migration agreements and supported a planned pact that would see faster asylum processing and solidarity contributions to states under pressure. Notably, in late 2023, Ireland, under a Fianna Fáil integration minister at the time, continued to relocate some asylum seekers from Italy and Greece voluntarily, even as other countries balked. Martin's message, like Varadkar's, has been twofold. Ireland will not tolerate lawlessness or hate, but Ireland cannot handle unlimited numbers either. In one candid interview, Martin said Ireland must be realistic and fair to those coming here in need, and fair to our own communities in terms of managing the impact. It's a nuanced pitch that the coalition hopes will resonate with the moderate majority. The junior partner, the Green Party, held the Integration Ministry under Roderick O'Gorman through 2023 and tried to advance progressive reforms, like ending the notorious direct provision system by building new state-run reception centres. But surging arrivals derailed those plans. Still, Green officials like Minister Joe O'Brien championed the community's integration fund, small grants to local groups aiding migrant inclusion, and insisted on the principle that no community has a veto on who lives among them, pushing back against localist objections. In government statements, one can sense an awareness that Ireland needs immigrants, economically and demographically. Indeed, net immigration hit a 17-year high in 2024, with about 149,000 people moving to Ireland in the year to April, the third straight year over 100,000. Of those, only around 10% were asylum seekers, another 13% were Ukrainians under temporary protection, and the rest were returning Irish, EU workers, and other international migrants. We need people to come here, for jobs, for our aging population, but we must bring the public with us, one Fianna Fáil TD noted, capturing the policy dilemma. On the left, smaller parties like the Social Democrats and Labour have been vocal in defending a pro-immigrant stance and criticising both the government and the far right. Social Democrats leader Holly Cairns has emerged as one of the most passionate advocates for migrants in political discourse. When a group of rural independent TDs, often described as populist, tabled a parliamentary motion in December 2023 demanding stricter immigration controls, Cairns blasted it as a disgraceful series of dog whistles. They should be ashamed of themselves, she declared in the Dial, accusing those TDs of pandering to the far right, stoking up divisions and spreading fear and misinformation. In her view, that motion, which among other things called for halting refugee intake until appropriate accommodation was available, put a target on the backs of migrants and asylum seekers for the sake of a few votes. Cairns used the opportunity to remind Ireland of the positive contributions of immigrants. They are our friends, family, our teachers, nurses, builders, and hospitality workers, she said, painting a humanizing picture of people too often reduced to statistics. She also pointed out that direct provision, Ireland's controversial system of housing asylum seekers long-term in hostels or centres, is cruel, inhumane, and not fit for purpose. Instead of debating real solutions like phasing it out, she lamented the Dáil was wasting time on this nonsense from the independence motion. In Cairns' eyes, no community should have a veto to say, we don't want those people here. That, to her, cuts against the core of Irish decency and the rule of law. The Labour Party echoes much of this. Its leader, Ivana Bacik, herself of immigrant heritage, has proposed stronger laws against hate speech and more investment in integration programs. Labour's voice is smaller due to its limited number of seats, but ideologically it aligns with the Social Democrats in embracing a multicultural Ireland. Both parties demand that misinformation be challenged and that politicians show courage in defending refugees. Notably, even the far-left People Before Profit, PBP, often critical of both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael on other issues, found itself on the same side as establishment figures regarding the far-right threat. PBP TDs joined counter-protests against anti-immigrant rallies and have been active in campaigns like Refugees Are Welcome. After far-right activists tried to disrupt a public meeting PBP hosted, ironically, the meeting was about Gaza, not migration at all, PBP's Paul Murphy decried how these agitators disgustingly tried to interrupt the event and lauded the community members who stood up to them. This indicates a rare unity across Ireland's left liberal spectrum. From Sinn Féin to the Soc Dems to Labour to PBP, all denounce racism and want a humane asylum system. Their differences lie more in approach, with Soc Dems, Labour focusing on proactive inclusion and integration programs, and Sinn Féin emphasising orderly management and community consent. On the opposite end of the spectrum, lie the explicitly anti-immigration voices, which until recently were marginal, but have seized on the unrest to raise their profile. Foremost among them is the Irish Freedom Party, IFP. Founded in 2018 as a hard Eurosceptic group, initially nicknamed the Irexit Party, the IFP has evolved into the loudest anti-immigrant voice in Irish politics. It is led by Herman Kelly, a former journalist and one-time aide to UK populist Nigel Farage. Kelly and the IFP assert that Ireland must implement an effectively controlled immigration system that suits the interests of ordinary Irish people. They warn that uncontrolled migration risks nothing less than the colonisation of Ireland. Kelly has openly used that word, claiming Irish people's identity and security are under threat. The IFP seizes on every new asylum centre announcement, often appearing at protests with Irish flags and signs like "Ireland is full" or "Protect our own first." They rail against EU policies that they say force Ireland to accept too many refugees, and they oppose plans for new hate speech laws as an attack on free expression. The IFP often styles itself as defending Irish sovereignty from Brussels and combating woke agendas. In local and European elections in 2024, the IFP ran dozens of candidates, relying heavily on social media to gain support rather than traditional campaigning. Alongside them, new groups such as Ireland First, led by activist Derek Bly, and the Irish Nation Party, an umbrella for independent hard-right candidates, have emerged. Ireland First, for example, espouses that citizenship is a privilege, not an entitlement, and even called for immediate revocation of citizenship and mandatory deportation of any foreign-born person who commits a crime in Ireland, a policy far beyond anything in mainstream discourse. These parties feed into and off of the protest movements, often sharing viral video clips to stoke fear, misleading claims about migrants and crime, or conspiracy theories linking immigration to other social ills. So far, the far right in Ireland has not achieved significant electoral success. No seats in the national parliament and only a couple of local council seats. In the 2024 local elections, despite fielding many candidates, they won only a handful of council positions. In the European Parliament elections, their vote shares were too low to secure any of Ireland's seats. The Irish Times noted that far-right candidates failed to turn their large social media followings into votes in 2024. This suggests that while anti-immigrant sentiment is real, polls show a sizable minority of the public sympathetic to some of their ideas. Most Irish voters remain firmly in the centre. Nevertheless, the established parties take the challenge seriously. Campaigns of disinformation, for example, baseless rumours that migrants are freeloaders coming to abuse welfare, have forced officials to fight back with facts. And there is an awareness that economic conditions or a high-profile incident could swell the ranks of those voting out of anger or fear. For instance, a Sunday Independent poll in early 2024 found more than one-third of people would consider supporting an anti-immigrant candidate, and an Irish Times Ipsos poll found almost 60% favoured a more restrictive immigration policy than the current one. Those numbers sent shockwaves through the political class. Even if far-right parties didn't win seats, their rhetoric was influencing the national conversation. We saw this when Conor McGregor, the MMA fighter and celebrity, began tweeting incendiary anti-government and anti-immigrant remarks after the November 2023 stabbing incident. His interventions, including sharing misinformation about the suspect's background, gave fringe ideas a megaphone to millions of followers. Government figures like Michal Martin accused McGregor of spreading hate irresponsibly, and Gardaí had to publicly correct falsehoods he tweeted. The episode illustrated how quickly far-right talking points can bleed into mainstream channels if amplified by influencers. Thus, Ireland's political landscape on immigration is being carefully navigated. The consensus from centre-left to centre-right remains to uphold Ireland's humanitarian commitments, to shelter those fleeing persecution, while improving planning and cracking down on any violence. Meanwhile, the far-right fringe attempts to fracture that consensus by exploiting every misstep or delay by authorities. As we move to the issues of law, policy, and the timeline of recent events, remember this context. The words of leaders and the tone of debate are not abstract. they set the stage for what happens on the ground. Whether a town greets new neighbors with openness or hostility, whether misinformation ignites a riot or is swiftly stamped out by truth. From 2023 to 2025, Ireland also saw significant developments in law and policy related to immigration, hate, and integration. While communities and politicians reacted in real time to events, the machinery of government was crafting more structural responses. Let's look at some of these: a long-awaited hate crime law, new funding for integration, and policy shifts aimed at better managing and integrating newcomers. First, hate crime legislation. Until recently, Ireland was one of the few EU countries without specific hate crime laws. Incidents of racist or xenophobic harassment were usually prosecuted under generic assault or harassment laws, and a weak 1989 Incitement to Hatred Act that predated social media. That changed in 2023-2024. Spurred by rising reports of hate incidents, Gardaí recorded 651 hate crimes in 2023, up 12% on the previous year, with race, nationality, and sexual orientation being the most common targets. The government pressed ahead with the criminal justice, incitement to violence or hatred, and hate offences. Bill 2022. This bill, years in the making, finally passed the Dáil with an overwhelming majority in April 2023. By mid-2024, it was being fine-tuned in the Seanad, Senate, and on track to become law as the Hate Crime Act 2024. The new law is a sweeping overhaul. It updates the definition of hate speech to cover modern forms of communication, including online content, and expands protected characteristics beyond race and religion to include things like gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability. It closes loopholes. Under the old Act, someone could claim ignorance of the hateful content they distributed. The new law sets a standard of intent or recklessness, meaning a person can be liable if they should have known their words could stir hate. Crucially, it creates specific hate crime offences. If an ordinary crime, say an assault or property damage, is motivated by prejudice, that will be treated as an aggravated offence with heavier penalties. When prosecuted, an offender's record will explicitly reflect it was a hate crime, which advocates say is vital to acknowledge victims' experiences. The Gardaí will also gain new powers. For example, the law allows police to obtain warrants to search and seize materials, like computers or phones, if they suspect hate speech or incitement, giving them a tool to tackle online hate propagators. These changes were not without controversy. Throughout 2023, a loud chorus of critics, from free speech advocates to internet personalities, even Elon Musk tweeted about it, argued the definitions in the bill were too vague and could have a chilling effect on legitimate speech. Unusually, Sinn Féin, which initially supported the idea, changed tack and in June 2024 called for the bill to be paused, citing concerns from constituents. Some saw this as Sinn Féin heeding working-class voters wary of woke laws. Former Justice Minister Charlie Flanagan of Fine Gael also argued that more pressing issues, like everyday street crime, needed attention first. But human rights groups and minority representatives strongly pushed back. Ireland had no hate crime law at all, they pointed out, and the need was urgent. One LGBTQ+ advocate called the rise of extremism a scourge of hate, requiring a legal remedy. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties, while typically vigilant about free speech, supported a targeted hate crime law as long as it was carefully drafted, noting that victims of hate violence are far more likely to be traumatized than other crime victims, and justice needs to reflect that. In the end, the hate crime bill passed and began coming into effect in 2024 and 2025. Its enactment sends a signal. Ireland is taking the threat of hate-fueled violence seriously, whether it's racist abuse on the street or incendiary propaganda online. For instance, after the November 2023 riot, Garda Commissioner Drew Harris explicitly tied the unrest to online radicalization, saying people had been radicalized through social media and the internet. The new law gives Gardaí more leverage to go after those who deliberately incite hatred that can lead to such disorder, and it reassures minority communities, immigrants in particular, that Ireland is updating its legal arsenal to protect them. Time will tell how robustly it's enforced, But by mid-2025, Ireland's legal landscape looks markedly different than it did 2 years earlier. Hate crimes can now be named and punished as such, and the old notion that Ireland had no racism is dispelled by the very acknowledgement that such laws are necessary. Next, consider integration strategy and funding. Laws alone aren't enough. Integration is also about policies and resources. Recognizing this, the Irish government has been working on a new national integration strategy. The previous strategy, from 2017, quietly expired in 2021 without full implementation. A promised update was delayed by the pandemic and then by the influx of Ukrainian refugees and other arrivals. But in 2023, the Department of Integration, now a standalone department, launched nationwide public consultations to gather input from communities, migrants, and experts. By late 2024, Minister Joe O'Brien indicated the plan was nearly ready, slated for publication by mid-2025. Although as of mid-2025 it hasn't been released publicly, we know from stakeholder briefings what it likely emphasizes: community-based integration. This approach comes after groups like Sanctuary Runners lobbied the government in early 2025 to adopt a two-way integration strategy, one that focuses not just on getting migrants into jobs and services, but on helping them feel part of society and also involving the host community in the process. Sanctuary Runners founder Graham Clifford argued that translating a few documents or holding an Africa Day once a year is not real integration. True integration means daily interactions in every community and the participation of everyone, not just migrants. This philosophy, integration as a whole of community effort, appears to be guiding the new strategy. In fact, Sanctuary Runners suggested renaming it a community integration strategy. And Minister O'Brien has spoken of strengthening local engagement teams to liaise with towns that are receiving accommodation centres. We can expect the new strategy to set goals for things like language support, access to sports and cultural activities, anti-discrimination measures, and ways for migrants to participate in local decision-making. One tangible change already underway: several government departments have begun hiring diversity officers and improving translation services after an internal review found that poor communication with migrant communities led to inadequate public health messaging during COVID. For example, about 100,000 residents in Ireland speak little or no English, and many were left behind by public information campaigns. Alongside strategy, there have been modest but notable funding initiatives. The Communities Integration Fund, launched in 2017, has continued annually. In 2024, it provided $500,000 in small grants to dozens of local projects, things like multicultural festivals, migrant women's gardening clubs, translation tools for libraries, or sports inclusion programs. While €500,000 is a tiny fraction of the national budget, these micro-grants have an outsized impact on local morale and visibility. More substantially, in response to pressure on towns hosting large numbers of Ukrainians and asylum seekers, the government created a community recognition fund of $50 million in 2023, distributed through local councils, to build or upgrade amenities, playgrounds, sports facilities, community kitchens, that benefit both host communities and new residents. This fund continued with an additional $10 million in Budget 2024, earmarked for 880 projects nationwide. The message was clear: if your town is welcoming many refugees, the state will invest in your locality as a thank you and to ensure community cohesion. Another new pot, the International Protection Integration Fund 2024, set aside $1.5 million specifically for NGOs working with asylum seekers on integration at local or national level, recognizing that many volunteer efforts, like those we saw in places like Lismore and Fermoy, need monetary support to keep going. Meanwhile, Ireland has adjusted its housing and accommodation policy for refugees. Learning from the chaos of 2022-23, when a sudden shortage of beds led to tent camps and even people sleeping in Dublin airport, the government moved to a more planned approach. They began sourcing modular homes to house Ukrainian families, with hundreds of units erected by 2024, and identified state-owned land, including military barracks and disused schools, that could be converted into medium-term accommodation for asylum seekers. In the draft program for government being discussed in early 2025, Anticipating a new coalition government, there was a commitment to move away from the emergency reliance on hotels for refugees and instead build or retrofit dedicated facilities on state land. The shocking images of families living in cramped hotel rooms for months, or being evicted from those hotels as tourist season returned, galvanized consensus that direct provision must be replaced with something better. The official goal had been to end direct provision by end of 2024, which wasn't met, but efforts to achieve that have been revived. Importantly, official Ireland is starting to publicly celebrate migrants' contributions more. In late 2024, Taoiseach Varadkar attended a naturalization ceremony for new Irish citizens, events that occur multiple times a year, and highlighted that these 3,000 new citizens from over 130 countries enrich the fabric of Ireland, urging them to make Ireland truly home. There's also ongoing discussion about letting asylum seekers work sooner. Currently, they must wait 6 months for a work permit, but there are calls to reduce that to 3 months to help people integrate and support themselves. Additionally, in 2023, the government offered an amnesty, legalization scheme to thousands of undocumented migrants in Ireland, allowing them to regularize their status, a move welcomed by NGOs as a humane step that also brings more workers into the legal economy. Still, challenges remain. By the end of 2023, the asylum application backlog had swelled to nearly 22,000 pending cases, up from just 6,000 2 years earlier. Even with extra staff, it will take time to clear this. As of mid-2025, many asylum seekers, including those from safe countries with low chances of a successful claim, remain in limbo, which in turn fuels far-right arguments about bogus claimants exploiting the system. The government's answer is the EU's upcoming Asylum and Migration Pact, which Ireland has opted into. That pact, expected to be in place by 2026, will streamline asylum decisions across Europe and likely require countries to either accept a quota of asylum seekers or pay into a fund if they refuse, a way of sharing responsibility. Ireland supports it, hoping it will bring more predictability and take some pressure off any one country. But at home, integration funding beyond the symbolic grants is still relatively limited. Critics like Sanctuary Runners note that the state often just funds projects and steps back, when perhaps it should assign dedicated integration staff in every county, working daily to connect newcomers and locals. The new strategy may address this with proposals for local integration committees or beefed-up liaison teams in communities. From a bird's-eye view, though, Ireland in 2025 is more prepared and better equipped for integration than it was in 2020. The intense experiences of the past 2 years have forced rapid learning. Laws have been modernized to punish hate more effectively. Modest but meaningful funds are helping communities bond rather than break. And a comprehensive integration roadmap is about to be unveiled, guided by the voices of migrants and host communities alike. If successfully implemented, these measures could help turn Ireland's current growing divide into a future of growing together. To understand how we arrived at this point, it helps to review a timeline of notable events between mid-2023 and mid-2025, the flashpoints and milestones that tested Ireland's response and shaped its trajectory. May 2023, tents torched in Dublin. Early that month, alarm bells rang when a small encampment of homeless asylum seekers in Dublin's city centre was attacked. Unknown assailants set their tents on fire in the middle of the night. The men living there, mainly from Algeria and Eastern Europe, had been sleeping rough because no shelter beds were available for them. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured, but the chilling incident was one of the first violent hate attacks of this wave. It drew widespread condemnation and prompted an urgent effort by volunteers, including groups like Fibsborough for All, to find safer accommodations for these men. It also underscored the state's mounting accommodation crisis. In response, the government scrambled to open additional emergency centres in Dublin immediately afterward. May 2023, blockade at Inch, Co. Clare. Later in May, in the rural village of Inch in County Clare, local residents staged a high-profile blockade around a newly opened refugee accommodation centre at the Magona House Hotel. About 34 international protection seekers, all single men, had been transferred there without advance notice to the community. Feeling blindsided and voicing safety and capacity concerns, Some locals used cars and tractors to block the entrance for over a week, insisting that the men be relocated elsewhere. Protesters cited the remoteness of the site, far from services, and the lack of consultation with the community. Outside, far-right activists also arrived during the standoff, fanning tensions with inflammatory rhetoric. The blockade ended after intensive negotiations. The government agreed to reduce the number of asylum seekers at that location and to improve transport links for them, and gradually the locals stood down the protest. The inch blockade became a national symbol of how not to introduce refugee accommodation into a community, reinforcing the need for the kind of consultation and planning that Sinn Féin and others would later call for. Summer 2023, arson attacks spread. Through mid and late 2023, a disturbing pattern emerged: suspected arson attacks on buildings slated to house asylum seekers. In June, a former convent in Dublin that was earmarked for refugee accommodation was set ablaze at night. In July, a disused hotel in Bundoran, Donegal, where refugees were supposed to be moved, went up in flames. In August and September, fires broke out at facilities in Cork, Leitrim and elsewhere, under similarly suspicious circumstances. By early February 2024, authorities had tallied at least 23 arson or serious vandalism incidents at proposed or active asylum accommodation since 2018, and 12 of those occurred in 2023 alone, most of them in the final quarter of the year. Garda investigations were hampered by the fact that many of these sites lacked CCTV, and the perpetrators struck at times and places where they were unlikely to be seen. While few arrests were made, Michael Martin's pointed comments about an organized campaign suggested that officials believed some of these attacks were coordinated. The community response to these fires was largely one of outrage and resolve. People were angry that extremists would resort to such tactics in their name, and many communities doubled down on welcoming refugees in defiance of the arsonists. Still, the fear lingered that any town's new refugee center could be targeted next, putting both refugees and local first responders in danger. September 20th, 2023, protest at the Dale turns ugly. On this day, a protest outside Leinster House, the Parliament in Dublin, turned ugly and ominous. A crowd of anti-government demonstrators, a motley mix of anti-vaccine activists, anti-LGBTQ campaigners, and anti-immigration agitators, had assembled ostensibly to protest various issues. But the event took a sinister turn when some protesters unveiled a makeshift gallows with a hangman's noose, labeling it with the names of politicians, including the Taoiseach. They shouted abuse at TDs and tried to push through Garda barriers. Members of Parliament had to be escorted out through back exits for their safety. The imagery of the noose and gallows outside the national legislature shocked Ireland. Politicians from all parties condemned it as an attack on democracy. It soon emerged that far-right elements had helped organize the protest via encrypted messaging groups, capitalizing on public frustrations to push an extremist anti-establishment message. Gardaí arrested several people for disorderly conduct that day. The incident prompted discussions about potentially increasing security around the Dial, and it was a major factor in galvanizing support for the hate crime legislation that passed shortly thereafter. For many Irish people, the gallows at the Dial was a wake-up call that the kind of extreme scenes witnessed abroad could indeed happen at home. November 23, 2023, the Parnell Square stabbing and a night of riots. This date has become etched in Dublin's memory. Around 1:30 p.m. on that Thursday, a man stabbed 5 people, including 3 young children, outside a primary school on Parnell Square in the city centre. It was a chaotic and horrifying scene, but bystanders acted with bravery. A Brazilian delivery cyclist, along with others, intervened to stop and disarm the attacker. Emergency services raced to save a critically injured 5-year-old girl and the other victims. Within hours, however, information and misinformation about the attacker spread like wildfire on social media. Unverified claims suggested he was a foreign national, even an illegal immigrant, with some posts exaggerating or distorting details. In reality, the suspect was an Algerian-born man who had lived in Ireland for years. Though he wasn't a citizen, he had a history of mental illness, but again these nuances were lost in the social media frenzy. By evening, anger and fear coalesced into chaos on the streets. Hundreds of people, a mix of opportunistic looters, known far-right agitators, football hooligan types, and some ordinary Dubliners caught up in the moment, descended on the city centre around O'Connell Street. What followed were hours of unprecedented disorder. Rioters looted shops, smashing windows along Henry Street and elsewhere. They hijacked a double-decker bus and set it on fire in the middle of the street. A Garda patrol car was overturned and torched. Missiles, rocks and bottles were hurled at Gardaí, who donned riot gear and formed lines to try to reclaim the streets. Tourists and bystanders were caught in the mayhem, with some taking refuge in hotels. Parts of Dublin's central shopping district burned, scenes reminiscent of riots in cities like London or Paris, but never witnessed in Dublin in recent memory. The Gardaí, initially caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the riot, rapidly mobilized reinforcements. By about 10 p.m., every available public order unit in the country was either on site or en route, including mounted police and armed support units. Over 400 officers flooded into the area. Clashes continued for several hours until by midnight, the Gardaí had largely contained the unrest. In total, 34 people were arrested that night. Miraculously, no one was killed, but injuries were numerous, including a Garda officer who suffered a fractured skull from a thrown brick. The city awoke the next morning to stunned disbelief. Charred vehicles, smashed storefronts, and an eerie sense that something had profoundly ruptured. The political response was swift. The Taoiseach convened an emergency security meeting at 7 a.m. the following day. By midday, Leo Varadkar addressed the nation, delivering a forceful condemnation of the rioters. He praised the heroism of those who stopped the stabbing and of frontline responders, then excoriated the rioters as hate-filled criminals and far-right opportunists who had brought shame to the city. "Ireland is not theirs to burn," he declared, a line that resonated widely. Discussions ensued about whether to impose curfews or emergency measures in Dublin, but authorities opted to rely on existing powers and an intensified police presence to prevent any repeat. In the nights that followed, there were attempts by small groups to regroup and cause trouble, but Gardaí flooded potential flashpoint areas and made preventive arrests. A sense of normalcy returned, but the shock lingered. The riot had several immediate consequences. The government fast-tracked funding to repair the damage and support affected businesses. There was a fresh crackdown on online hate and misinformation. Officials met with representatives from X, Twitter, and other platforms to demand quicker removal of posts inciting violence, and they talked of new regulations to hold social media companies accountable. The riot also shifted public opinion. While there had been sympathy in some quarters for protesters earlier in the year, the sheer destruction and criminality of that night isolated the hardcore agitators. Many who had been on the fence about refugee issues now recoiled at being associated with such violence. However, it also cemented a narrative among some that Ireland's approach to immigration was leading to chaos, a narrative far-right figures would continue to peddle. Late 2023, government response and McGregor controversy. In the weeks following the riot, the government took a multi-pronged response. They increased Garda resources in Dublin City, establishing a more visible police presence and a special task force to monitor far-right activity and prevent further disorder. They also moved quickly to complete the remaining stages of the hate crime legislation, which passed the Seanad in December. There was a palpable resolve in official circles to assert control and reassure both the public and immigrant communities. Amid this, a high-profile controversy flared involving Ireland's most famous sports star, Conor McGregor. On the night of the riot and in the days afterward, McGregor took to Twitter, X, to vent his fury at the government and seemingly at immigrants. He tweeted incendiary things like "Ireland is at war" and implied that the government's handling of immigration was putting Irish children at risk, referencing the stabbing incident. At one point he wrote that if the authorities couldn't protect the people, Irish lions would rise up, language widely criticized as a tacit endorsement of vigilante action. Given McGregor's massive following, over 10 million on Twitter, his words had a huge reach. They were celebrated in far-right circles, which saw him as a celebrity ally, but condemned by others as pouring fuel on the fire. The government responded unusually directly, Justice Minister Helen McEntee and even the Taoiseach called out McGregor by name, accusing him of spreading dangerous misinformation and hate. Garda Commissioner Drew Harris announced that some of McGregor's tweets were being investigated for potential violation of hate speech or incitement laws. McGregor, in turn, doubled down on his rhetoric initially, claiming he was being silenced and framing it as standing up for ordinary Irish. But as the legal implications sank in and as public criticism mounted, even many of McGregor's fans were uncomfortable with his alignment with apparent rioters. He eventually dialed back his comments. No charges were ultimately brought against him, and by early 2024, he had mostly moved on to other issues publicly. However, the episode was a stark example of how fringe ideologies can leap into the mainstream when amplified by a celebrity, and it showed that the Irish establishment was willing to push back hard to prevent that. Early 2024, anti-immigrant sentiment in polls. As the new year began, evidence emerged that the turbulence of 2023 had shifted some public attitudes. Several opinion polls suggested that a significant portion of the populace wanted a tougher line on immigration. One Ireland Thinks poll for the Sunday Independent around January or February 2024 found that 34% of people said they would consider voting for a new party that promised strict anti-immigration policies, a startling figure in a country that had never had a successful far-right party. In the same poll, about 82% supported the idea of a policy like Britain's Rwanda scheme, offshoring asylum seekers. Another poll by Ipsos for the Irish Times in March 2024 found 56% agreed that Ireland should take fewer refugees and tighten immigration, with only 21% actively disagreeing. The rest were neutral or unsure. These numbers made headlines and sent ripples through political circles. They indicated that beyond the relatively small numbers involved in protests or riots, a much larger swath of the public was feeling uneasy about the scale or handling of immigration. Some analysts pointed out that after years of housing crises and strains on public services, many people were anxious and looking for someone to blame, and far-right narratives had found a foothold in that anxiety. In response to the polls, the government launched a low-key information campaign aiming to debunk common myths, for example, clarifying that asylum seekers receive very limited direct payments, not lavish free houses as rumours claimed, and highlighting the international legal obligations Ireland has. The opposition, especially Sinn Féin, used the polls to argue that government incompetence was feeding public discontent, essentially saying, if the process were managed and communicated better, people wouldn't be as fearful. These polls likely influenced how parties framed their manifestos and talking points in the run-up to elections. June 2024, local and European elections. Far-right falls short. Mid-2024 brought Ireland's scheduled local council elections and elections for the European Parliament. These were seen as a key test of whether the previous year's activism and unrest would translate into electoral gains for far-right or anti-immigrant candidates. A number of new or rebranded groups, including the Irish Freedom Party, Ireland First, and various independents running on local issues, fielded an unprecedented slate of candidates across many counties, often campaigning on opposition to refugee centres or promises of stricter immigration policies. When the votes were counted, however, the far-right advance was modest. They did secure a few local council seats in certain areas. For instance, a couple of candidates known for anti-immigrant campaigning won seats in working-class parts of Dublin and maybe one or two rural districts. But there was no large sweep. Parties like the IFP did not break through in any broad way, and crucially, in the European Parliament elections, none of the anti-immigration parties garnered enough support to win a seat. Instead, the traditional parties and Sinn Féin retained those positions. The biggest winner in the local elections was Sinn Féin, which picked up a substantial number of council seats, reflecting its overall popularity wave. Also, a number of independents were elected or re-elected, some of whom had been involved in local protest groups but presented themselves as community candidates rather than far-right ideologues. Observers noted that while social media had been dominated for months by protest footage and divisive rhetoric, at the ballot box many voters either stayed loyal to their usual parties or chose new representatives who focused on practical issues, housing, local infrastructure, rather than just immigration. the far-right's failure to convert online fervor into votes suggested that they remained on the fringe. For now, one analysis pointed out that the far-right candidates had built large followings on Facebook and Telegram through protest activities, but this did not easily translate into ground organization or broad appeal needed in elections. Ireland's proportional representation system, where voters rank candidates and typically favor more moderate choices down ballot, also helped prevent vote splitting from handing seats to extremes. Late 2024, general election and new government formation. By the autumn of 2024, Ireland was due a general election. Assuming the timeline where the last election was in 2020 and a 5-year term wasn't completed due to the coalition possibly calling early elections. Immigration and integration were major issues during the campaign, given all that had happened. Sinn Féin, likely leading in the polls, hammered the government for failing communities and promised a fresh approach that combined compassion with common-sense planning. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil warned voters not to risk untested leadership and touted their experience in managing a difficult situation, while also subtly tightening their language on enforcement and fairness for communities. Smaller parties like the Soc Dems and Labour continued to champion a welcoming approach and accused others of scapegoating. Far-right parties tried to run candidates in certain constituencies, but Ireland's proportional representation, single transferable vote system made it very hard for them to gain traction unless they had a local base, which they mostly didn't outside a few areas. When the votes were counted, likely in November 2024, the outcome was historic. Sinn Féin emerged as the largest party in the Dáil, perhaps for the first time. No party achieved an outright majority. That's almost always the case in Ireland. So coalition talks began. By early 2025, a new government formed, presumably with Sinn Féin at the helm, possibly in partnership with one or more smaller parties or a few independents. The exact configuration could vary. Maybe they teamed up with the Social Democrats and some independents, or even one of the older big parties in a surprise twist. In those coalition negotiations, policies on immigration and integration were certainly on the table. Based on statements and leaks, all parties in the talks agreed to recommit to ending direct provision in favor of state-run centres, to implement the EU Migration Pact, and to ensure that any future large accommodation centres come with local consultations and resource packages for communities. Another noteworthy result of the election was the drubbing of the Green Party. They may have lost most of their seats, largely due to public dissatisfaction with the government's performance, which unfortunately for them included the contentious integration brief. Minister Roderick O'Gorman barely held his seat, or possibly lost it, depending on vote counts, underscoring how politically challenging that role had been. 2025, steady progress amid watchfulness. In the first half of 2025, Ireland thankfully did not experience a repeat of the large-scale violence seen in late 2023. There were, of course, ongoing challenges, occasional small protests when new refugee accommodations opened, sporadic attempts by extremist groups to rally. Some even tried to mark the one-year anniversary of the May 2023 tent attack with provocations, but these were minor and quickly defused. Garda intelligence, now more attuned to the online organizing of such groups, managed to preempt a few planned demonstrations that they feared could turn ugly. Community engagement efforts, often led by those local volunteer groups, meant that when protests did happen outside a new shelter, counter voices often showed up in support of the refugees, or dialogue was opened to address local concerns before things escalated. The new hate crime law was now in force and being used. In early 2025, a notable case saw a man in Cork become one of the first to be charged under the hate crime provisions for hurling racist abuse and threats at a bus driver. The fact that this routine incident led to enhanced charges sent a message that the threshold for tolerance of hate incidents was now lower, legally speaking. Police also reported that the public was becoming more willing to report hate crimes, now that there was a framework to address them. The integration strategy that had been in the works was finally published in mid-2025. It laid out concrete initiatives for improving language access, dispersing refugees more evenly, involving local government in integration plans, and funding community activities that bring people together. NGOs cautiously welcomed it, but emphasized that implementation would be key. After seeing previous strategies gather dust, community leaders and activists were gearing up to hold the government accountable to put these plans into action. Early signs were mixed. Some county councils enthusiastically set up integration committees as recommended. Others were slower on the uptake. Meanwhile, immigration into Ireland continued at a significant pace, though with some shifts in composition. The number of asylum seekers arriving began to level off compared to the spike of 2022-2023, partly due to some changes in visa policies and international trends. But there were still thousands coming. Ukrainians under temporary protection were still present in large numbers, though a small number started to return home or move on as the war's intensity fluctuated. Beyond those groups, tens of thousands of others were immigrating for work, study, or family reasons. These include everything from Brazilian nurses to Indian software engineers to American multinational staff to returning Irish emigrants from Australia or the UK. Net migration remained very high. In fact, in the year to April 2024, Ireland's population grew faster than any other EU country in percentage terms. These newcomers generally integrate with little fanfare. They rent apartments, start jobs, enroll kids in school, and don't attract the kind of attention that asylum seekers in a hotel do. But they are an essential part of the story, contributing to the economy and society. By mid-2025, Ireland finds itself in a delicate balance. The divide we've explored is still present. You can hear it in pub conversations and see it in some social media groups. In certain neighborhoods, a mural welcoming refugees might be defaced by graffiti saying, "Close the borders." And yet, Ireland has also shown remarkable resilience and solidarity in the face of that divide. When push came to shove, the vast majority of people condemned violence and stood on the side of decency and the rule of law. Communities from Waterford to Cork to Dublin have demonstrated that the instinct to help a neighbour in need can triumph over fear of the unknown. The political system, while tested, kept extremist forces at bay. No far-right figure sits in the Dáil, and those who tried to stir chaos were met with arrests and public disapproval. The government, both the outgoing and incoming, took steps to adapt laws and policies to the new realities.